So all human beings are born with this thing that Chomsky calls universal grammar. And that capacity for universal grammar is what enables humans to learn any language present on the face of this earth. Obviously, the issue with this is that it's very difficult to prove his theory empirically speaking, because there are about 50,000 plus languages in the world. There are verbal languages, non-verbal languages, and for his theory to be proven true, we have to find some commonality between the grammatical rules of every single language that exists, right? Because that's what his theory stands on the base of. So that's something to, that's as much as I love Noam Chomsky's work, this is something that, although is interesting and can appear to be true, it's hard to say if it is absolutely true because it is so hard for us to test the theory. So you see, when Shahan, you say all languages have nouns and adjectives and verbs, what you're doing is you're forgetting that you're using the rules of English grammar to define the way that these terms appear, right? So if you just consider at the most basic level, one of the biggest differences between English and Urdu is that while English has the word them or they or theirs, which usually is used to refer to a collective, but now is also used as a non-binary gender pronoun. In Urdu, we have been using the words usse ya unke for so many years now, right? And that is never referred to as a gender neutral pronoun, even though it is. So just consider that you're using the rules of one language and applying them to another, and they don't fit as perfectly as you want them to. That's the difference, right? So you know how you say that phrase that things get lost in translation. This is why things get lost in translation. So while there are obviously similarities between all languages, it's hard to say conclusively that the similarities are such that we are born with those already hardwired into our brains. So that's one aspect of language. The other aspect, which we sometimes call, it's called um, determinism, and then there's relativism when we talk about linguistic determinism and linguistic relativism. And so linguistic determinism is related a little bit or similar in some ways to what Chomsky is saying, because when you talk about linguistic determinism, we're saying that we again are born with this capacity to learn language. And so there are basically parts of our brain that enable us to acquire it. But sorry, before we get to that, just remember linguistic determinism. It's the last thing that we'll talk about today. I got ahead of myself. Okay, right. Oh, fine. Now I have my trusty slides, so I remember what I was doing. So we talked about Chomsky's perspective, but we also talked a little bit about the information perspective or the information processing perspective, whereby much like a computer, your brain receives language-based information. Your brain is primed to receive that information because you do have two particular areas in the brain that are responsible for language, but also the language that you're receiving is basically sounds, right? And your brain makes sense of these sounds and encodes each of those sounds with a meaning. And that is how you construct language, and that is how you are able to, much like a computer algorithm places different paths that are relevant in one particular shape so that it solves a problem or constructs something, your brain works in that similar way. But again, even for the information processing perspective, it's hard to prove empirically, right? How do you see something apart from just relying on the activity in the brain areas? Which brings me to this other thing about nonverbal language. So when we talk about nonverbal language, we're talking about at the most essential level, sign language, right? And the question always becomes, well, if language is not something we're born to acquire or born with the capacity to acquire, then how is it that who, then how is it that deaf people are able to learn sign language, right? And the reason is that they have a highly evolved sense of visual processing. Okay, so their visual sense perception is strong. And you remember this goes back to our study on sensation and perception a little bit, where one sense can overcompensate for a deficit in another sense perception process, right? And so similar to that. And so for at the same time, if you can connect this part of one sense perception faculty overcompensating for another one or becoming highly advanced due to a deficit in another one, if you relate that to what you learned about how years 0 to 3 is the most rapid period of brain development, and so that's when you're most sensitive to everything that happens in your experience, and that includes external input, external sense perception, right? And that also, by the way, includes language. It's a very critical period for language. If you recall the development of language from sounds to babbling to eventually speech to complex speech. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that when you receive a cochlear implant, the younger you are, the more effective it becomes, because the younger you are, the less the auditory cortex has been repurposed. Okay, by repurposed, it means that the less the burden is, the younger you are on the auditory cortex to process any sort of auditory information, right? It hasn't become set, let's say, right? And that is why you are able to learn a sign language much more easily when you're younger. But when we think about children who are born deaf, we also have to consider that their parents may not be deaf, right? And then in line with that, you consider that the parents of a deaf child do learn, if they are not deaf, they will be able to learn sign language. And they are able to learn sign language to communicate with their child. And in some cases, they are the people also trying to help their child learn sign language, right? And that age gap between the child and the parent, it kind of helps you think through the fact that the environment continues to provide stimulus. And even if it's an imperfect stimulus, such as the case of the parent who doesn't know sign language and is learning it to teach it to their child, even then, there is a capacity in the brain to acquire language, even when it is non-verbal language. Because at the end of the day, remember, when we define language, language is essentially a collection of symbols that we associate meaning to. Those symbols can be written symbols, right? Or they can be visual symbols, right? Like action-based symbols. Or they can be symbols that translate into different sounds, morphemes, phonemes, if you remember that. So at the end of the day, our brain is able to decode those symbols and construct meaning from those symbols, which leads you to the next important part about language, beyond the theories of how it develops, to what is it in the brain that helps you acquire language, right? We can't say specifically for sure that, oh, there's universal grammar. We can't say specifically that, oh, yes, information processing exists in the brain. The brain is like a computer, absolutely. But we can say that there are two areas in the brain, one which is in the frontal lobe and in the left hemisphere, and one which is in the left temporal lobe. So if your frontal lobe is here, this part, then your temporal lobe is somewhere around here, all right? So in your frontal lobe, you have which area? Broca's area. And in your temporal lobe, you have Wernicke's area, and they're both usually towards the left side of the brain. which also, by the way, contributes to gender bias in studies that claim that women are better with language than men. Because, women are left brain and men are right brain and all that nonsense. So in Broca's area, what is happening is that when you say something, right, your jaw moves are movements that happen, actual physical movements that happen within you to promote speech. Broca's area is involved in that promotion of speech by controlling those muscles, controlling those motor movements, right? Muscle movements, rather. And so it's concerned with the expression of language. On the flip side, what Wernicke's area does is that it is concerned in the way that you understand language, right? So in a really easy way, and something we've been saying all along, Broca's area, think of it as the one involved in sentence construction and expression, whereas Wernicke's area is what gets involved when someone is talking to you, you're understanding what they're saying, and you're putting it together to respond. So Wernicke's area is where your meaning of language lives, and Broca's area is where the capacities that help you speak in a particular language or use your hands to communicate a particular language, that is in Wernicke's area. In Broca's area. Okay. And so whether there's damage in Broca's area or whether there's damage in Wernicke's area, there's a differential impact on your language capacity. And this impact that happens that affects the way that you speak or the way that you talk is called aphasia, right? And now, like I said, when aphasia occurs, if it has impacted Broca's area, what's going to happen? If there's damage to Broca's area, which we now know controls the motor expression of your speech, but also just the construction and expression of language, what happens to you if your Broca's area is damaged?
We speak unsensible, like मतलब हमें पता होता है कि हम क्या कह रहे हैं, लेकिन मतलब जो वर्ड्स होते हैं वो नहीं होते, मतलब कुछ और ऐसे अजीब बोल रहे होते हैं.
Yes, absolutely right. It's incoherent, it's jumbled. We can't connect the meanings of the words that we know in Wernicke's area appropriately to express it. Because there's that disconnect between what words mean, which is essential for you to construct a sentence and express it. And so, yes, it's jumbled speech or it's expression impairment. So you could also just be slurring if there's damage, Naval, that's good. And then the second thing, tell me what happens when there's damage to Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is the one responsible for the meanings of things, huh?
I think that means that you cannot understand, basically अगर Wernicke area damage हो जाएगा तो you cannot understand the language. You can just you know.
Yes, you're right. You cannot understand correctly a
That person only जो सामने वाला होगा.
We also cannot learn new words, I guess.
Please continue. Laiba, your voice got cut off, but you were right to say that we don't understand properly what other people are saying because the meanings of the words that they're saying are not properly sort of stored in our mind anymore. And yes, we may not be able to learn new words and remember them correctly because of the damage to the meaning part of language capacities in the brain. Sorry. So here's the thing. People might think of language as a skill, right? It's a skill. When someone can speak more than 2 languages or 3 languages, we can refer to them as a polyglot, a multilingual person, etc., etc. But in the context of psychology, language plays a slightly deeper role. In the context of psychology, we want to talk about the relationship between thought and language, right? Our class, before we started talking about language, was about how we think. Now, if you remember, and I was telling you about heuristics, which are cognitive shortcuts, I was explaining to you that when you have those cognitive shortcuts, you refer to, there's the availability heuristic, so you refer to the most recently available prototype in your mind, or there's a representativeness heuristic where you refer to the most similar thing that is stored in your mind. So you have to ask yourself that, is there a language that the brain thinks in, right? Why is it that in psychology we don't consider language a skill? Instead, we consider it an important part of our cognition, because remember, cognition refers to thinking, learning, communicating. So why do we think this way about language? Think this way about language. That's your answer. Because yes, Laiba.
Because we think in a language, basically the language we learn, we think in that language. That's why we refer to a lot of, this language development a lot in psychology.
Yes, we think in a language. Absolutely correct. Now, there are two ways to approach this. Okay, one is called linguistic determinism, one is called linguistic relativism. Determinism is related a little bit to the fact that yes, you have this mental capacity to learn language, and that's where the language stops, right? So you have this mental capacity to learn language, and that mental capacity means that there is a certain extent to which you can learn language. So related to that is this idea of linguistic determinism, which says that if you don't have the language to refer to something, it is just not something that enters your sphere of thought, right? So in other words, if there isn't a word for it, you're not going to experience it, you're not going to think about it. Okay. And the flip side is called linguistic relativism, which says that your language doesn't determine the way that you think as much as you think it does. So linguistic relativism says that language is important, absolutely important, and it definitely shapes our thoughts, right? Because we use language to give some nuance to our thoughts, to give some detail to our thoughts, to, when I'm very, very fond of using this word, think through something. So when you're thinking through something, you're relying on language to think through it. Often I would tell students in my English classes that, you think in Urdu and then you translate your thoughts into English when you're writing your papers. And that is why you're making so many grammatical errors, because there's a difference between the construction of the two languages. Okay. But it's important, this point. The difference was in the construction of the two languages, which meant that the literal translation from Urdu to English or English to Urdu can sometimes be completely something that doesn't make sense, right? But that does not mean that there are things that are present in English that you can't think about at all, right? So while your capacity for English shapes, or lack of capacity for English, let's say, shapes the way that you think about something, and it can absolutely determine the way or how much of something you're able to understand when it's in English, which is not our native language. That doesn't mean that we can't think about something that we don't know. If that were true, which determinism says, right? If that were true, tell me something. In this course, when you started this course, just this word I just mentioned to you, aphasia, you didn't know it existed, right? You didn't know it existed, but while I was explaining what aphasia is to you, you were able to think about it. Some reference points in your brain came up, right? Something popped. So while, yes, it may have been difficult to understand what the word meant, it did not render you unable to understand what the word meant. You are still able to approach it from an indirect perspective, even if it is a word that is out of your frame of thought. And that is what relativism says. A language influences the way you think, but it doesn't determine what you think about or how you think. Got it? Don't got it? Okay. Questions? No questions? So when you think about language in psychology, just always think about it in relation to thinking. Okay, because that is the point of departure, your perspective with which we approach our capacity for language, whereby language is essentially different symbols that exist and how we give meaning to those symbols. Okay, now the next thing we want to start talking about today is intelligence theory. And intelligence theory is one of the most, it's rather controversial in some ways. But the controversy of intelligence theory is it lies in the dark past of psychology, where, and I've told you this multiple times, psychology has essentially been a very racist social science for many, many, many decades. And the way that we think about intelligence is related to, well, some of it is related to the racism of psychology, and we'll talk about that as well. But more importantly, the way I was telling you that when you think about language in a psychological context, this is how you think about it in relation to the way that it is linked to our cognitive capacity. In the same way, think about intelligence as linked to the cognitive capacity when we are talking about it in this class, right? So when we talk about theories of intelligence, do not think of this in the usual subjective value-based way that we look at intelligence. Okay, and that's something that you may have experienced yourself. I think personally, one of the greatest sort of insults you can give someone is to call them stupid. It is probably so there are some words, okay? Stupid, idiot, moron. These three words are the worst things you can say to someone. Why? Because they reflect a value judgment on their intelligence. Okay? When you, as a student, think about this. As a student, what's your greatest insecurity? That you're not smart enough, right? So forget about those value-based notions about being smart or being stupid or whatever. When we are talking about intelligence, we're talking about cognitive capacity, right? And overall cognitive capacity, sorry, which is related to your essentially reasoning, right? And not just intelligence is not just about what you know. This is the greatest sort of problem with the value-based approach to intelligence, which is the approach outside of psychological research and terminology. Value-based approach to intelligence says कि you are only as smart as what you know. The more you know, the smarter you are. But the truth of the matter is, when you really think about some of the more intelligent people you've known in your life, yes, they know a lot. They know so much. But it's more about what they are able to do with everything that they know. Right? So simply just, let's say, being able to recite a book from memory does not mean that you can use all the knowledge in that book in interdisciplinary multiple ways. And so, are you really intelligent, or are you just someone who has a fabulous memory? Right? As defined by psychology, everyone has intelligence. First thing. every human being is born with intelligence, of which 60% is inherited. You remember our lecture on epigenetics, 60% is inherited, right? And the most basic sort of theory of intelligence, which led to the development of different other theories of intelligence, is that we are all possessed with what are called different mental faculties. Okay? So we have these faculties, these little abilities in our mind, and they just kind of exist, and in accumulation, they are our intelligence. So those faculties are like our reasoning ability, our memory is part of those faculties. Our ability to tell the difference between one thing and the other, i.e. discrimination, that's also part of our mental faculties. And so there's this, intelligence is just this mental faculty, right? Taken together, a combination of different mental faculties. So that will come to Howard Gardner. So that's where it begins in the 18th century. Intelligence is a combination of what are called mental faculties. Okay, that's a technical term used for earliest theories of intelligence. Now, that's also where the racism element comes in. When we talk about eugenics, eugenics was very racist science because it determined that people from particular races are genetically born with less intelligence. So for this racist science to be true, what also had to be true is that the intelligence you're born with is the intelligence you then possess for the rest of your life. Again, we know this to not be true now, right? But you see, eugenics proposes that aapki intelligence at point A, whatever it is, when you're born, is what it stays. And so people from what these eugenicists refer to as lower races are never going to be able to achieve what the white man has achieved. So us, essentially, are born less intelligent, which, for it to be true, should mean that intelligence is something that you can measure, that you can quantify, and it does not change. That means intelligence becomes petrified, set in stone, reified. That's the correct word, reified. Thankfully, today we have overcome that reification, and there were many. I could give you an entire lecture on this. I'm not going to. And so anyway, from this early notion of human faculties, what we have now come to understand today is that intelligence is something that is very diverse. It's not something that is necessarily static, in the sense that it's not something that doesn't change. And that standardized tests of measuring intelligence are actually not measuring this essential intelligence, which is impossible to measure. What they actually measure is your reasoning abilities, your numerical abilities, and your linguistic abilities. And those are absolutely parts of intelligence, right? But they are not the only things that make up human intelligence. So now let me tell you about Wechsler. So Wechsler, his theory was that, again, these reasoning capacities that we have, they comprise our intelligence, but Wechsler saw our reasoning capacities as very broad, right? Did not reduce things down to just one form. So Wechsler came up with the WISC. Sorry, I'm trying to find my notes on this. By the way, I apologize. I didn't make a presentation on the weekend, so you don't have a presentation. Sorry. So I'll make one later today and I'll send it to you. So Wechsler says that yeah, got it. So Wechsler, his original theory is that there is this complex sort of web of different reasoning capacities. So you have, for example, numerical capacity, right? Which I already told you. You have numerical skill, but related to your numerical skill is also your numerical reasoning skill. Okay, so which means that if I give you a number series and then I tell you to repeat it to me backward, I am not just testing your memory, I'm also making you exercise your reasoning abilities, because I'm telling you, I told you 1, 2, 3, 4. When I ask you to recite it backward, you have to think about what the backward order is, right? So दो चीजें, आपकी working memory test हो रही है and आपकी reasoning capacity test हो रही है, to flip that series over, right? Or if I show you different images and I ask you, what is this? Again, you have to think with rationality to be able to understand what the object is, even if the object is something as simple as an apple. The other most important thing about Wechsler's aggregate view of intelligence is that he accounts for the fact that intelligence differs at different ages. So the Wechsler intelligence scale, I've forgotten the exact name of the test. I have administered this test, and it is a wonderful test. The important thing about the WISC, that's what we call it, Wechsler intelligence scale something, composite something, I've forgotten, I'll tell you, it'll be in the presentation. So the important thing about the WISC is that it tests you differently between different age brackets. So it's one test, right? And right now we use the 5th version of the original WISC. And you can use that one test for children between age, I think, 2 to 6, 7 to 11, 11 to 18, or 11 to 16. Okay, so that entire age bracket, you can use the WISC for. The questions that apply are different for different age brackets. So the WISC acknowledges the fact that intelligence changes over time. The issue is that the WISC exists in English, which makes it a little ineffective for people who do not speak English, correct? Or for whom English is not the native language. So that's something that is a problem. And that's a problem with all intelligence tests, okay? But the takeaway here is that Wechsler said there is an aggregate present within us of these different abilities, and that is our intelligence. And the difference between, let's say, you and me and the person next door is that we are all different in the way that we experience and understand complex ideas, the way that we interpret the environment. There are differences in the way that we learn from our experiences. There are differences in the way that we engage in activities that are meant to teach us, right? So each of you in this class is learning, understanding, interpreting, experiencing in a different way. And that difference comes down to the difference between the global aggregate of your abilities, okay? Of your reasoning abilities, of your numerical skills, of your linguistic skills, and how you are able to use those when you approach problems or when you approach any piece of information. So that's Wechsler's theory. The other one I want you to know about, and there are quite a few, is Thorndike's theory. Okay, Thorndike, if you remember, related to behaviorism. Thorndike's law of effect is what was at the basis of classical conditioning. The more you do something, the less you have to strive to do it, and the more sort of able you are to do it. Does anybody want to remember Thorndike? Tell us what the law of effect was. No? Okay. Thorndike, in his, you can consider him to be the foundation of behaviorism, because his law of effect is what led to, what's his name, Skinner's implementation of wow, I've forgotten what it was, positive and negative reinforcement. Sorry, I had a mental blank there. Anyway, so Thorndike says, true behaviorist fashion, what you can't see, right? This general intelligence, this global aggregate, he says that doesn't matter to me, it doesn't exist. Instead of that, he says there are 4 things. And again, you'll notice when I tell you what these 4 things are, there are 4 things that you can see. Okay. Zephyr, thank you. Yes, operant conditioning. Anyway, Thorndike says that there are 4 mental activities that take place, or there are 4 mental, there are 4 mental attributes that determine how we approach these activities that we do with our mind. Okay? Level, range, area, and speed. Again, you'll notice these are things you can look at, right? So level means how difficult is the task that you're able to do. Speed obviously means how quickly you're able to do the task, obviously accurately. Area means how widely are you able to do that task. So if I'm telling you to, if I'm looking at your capacity for addition, then I'm going to look at how well you add 2 plus 2, but also 1,05,025 to 1, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I know that's not a number, just bear with me. Okay. So it's how you use that capacity to a broad number of areas. Area. See? And the third thing is the range. How many tasks do you have to do at a particular difficulty level? So again, he's talking about intelligence very much, you'll notice, in the way that IQ tests try to measure intelligence. Right? Speed hota hai IQ test mein? Yes. You have to do it within a certain time. Area hota hai? Yes. There's a wide scope of things. Dusra, range hota hai? Yes. The level of difficulty changes as you go through it, especially now in computer-based testing. Have you noticed when you actually you don't have experience of that, when you give the graduate test, the GRE, the questions you answer correctly determine how difficult the next question is. So if you're getting easy questions wrong, the test remains at the easy level. But if you ace all the easy questions, the questions become increasingly more and more difficult. So you can see that it's sort of inspired by this. All right, now the next thing from Thorndike is something that makes a lot of sense to me, which is Spearman's two-factor theory. Okay. And again, Spearman's two-factor theory was also important. It does sort of affect the ways in which we approach intelligence today. According to Spearman, we all have this general intelligence, which is, remember I was telling you there's a G? We use G to refer to general, and I think maybe it was not this class, sorry. So G is what you use to refer to general intelligence according to Spearman. And the second factor, Spearman is, remember, inspired by the human factors approach to intelligence, which was in the early 18th century, right? So the second factor is specific intelligence, or S. So according to, what's his name, Spearman, you're born with this G, this general intelligence, and then S is everything you learn from your environment. So G plus S is your intelligence, total. Okay, where G is general intelligence and S is specific intelligence. Now, this is a simplistic way to look at intelligence, but it does help us think about, let's say, what I told you, 60% of our intelligence is inherited, right? Or the fact that intelligence changes as you grow older, specific intelligence, you learn things from the environment. So it does make sense. It's just that how do you prove that general intelligence exists when you're born, right? So again, that we run into that same, right. Then there's, I'm gonna skip, there's so many theories of intelligence. I'm just going to teach you the ones that I use in my work because I think they're the most relevant. And if you have questions about something that I don't cover, feel free to ask me later. The other theory, so right now we've talked about Sternberg. No, we haven't yet. He's next. No, he's second next. Sorry, we've talked about Wechsler. We've talked about the human faculties. We've talked about the two-factor theory, Spearman, and we've talked about Thorndike's approach, where intelligence is simply something that you perform, is determined by the attributes of the way that you approach tasks. So speed, area, and difficulty level and range of tasks are things that Thorndike talks about. And then we talk about Spearman, we talk about general intelligence, specific intelligence. The next person we're going to talk about is Cattell. And actually, it's not just one person, Cattell. Cattell worked with a couple of researchers, and Cattell said that we have fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Okay, fluid intelligence is your reasoning abilities that you are born with. Okay, and then your crystallized intelligence is that you acquire information as you grow along, and how do you apply that information to your reasoning abilities? That's your crystallized intelligence. So fluid is assuming that you're born with certain level of information already, or certain capacities already. And then generalized intelligence is that you acquire from your environment new experiences that cumulatively add to your reasoning ability. Okay, so if you just think about the fact that you are able to understand the examples presented in our class, right, of let's say taking a test or blanking out or whatever, you are drawing on past experiences to make sense of the information being given to you. So Thorndike, Cattell and his team of researchers would say that you're using your crystallized intelligence, right? But there's a relationship between fluid and crystallized intelligence, because without fluid intelligence, you cannot have crystallized intelligence. So the level of your fluid intelligence affects how much crystallized intelligence you are in possession of. So essentially, that genetic potential that you have, which is your fluid intelligence, it affects the ways in which your crystallized intelligence is built, right? Yes? Completely lost you? Got it. Okay, fine. Next up, we talk about Sternberg. Sternberg, again, someone I really like, he came up with a triarchic theory. So he says, okay, you know what? Too many people have been talking about 2 components or 4 components. I'm going to come up with 3 components. And his approach is interesting because it's very broad. So he proposes these 3 things in this triarchic system of intelligence, where you have practical intelligence, you have creative intelligence, and you have analytical intelligence. The practical intelligence is essentially drive a car, practical intelligence. Creative intelligence is there's a roadblock you didn't know about, you figure out a different route to take, right? You come up with a new situation, you figure out how you're going to deal with it. Creative intelligence. And your analytical intelligence is you decide that you're going to cheat the speed limit by driving 10 miles above and then reducing it, and driving 10 miles above and then reducing it before you can actually get caught. Bad example, please don't ever do that, but this is your analytical intelligence, where you're looking at a situation and you're like, I'm going to solve this problem. How am I going to solve this problem? I'm running so late to work. How can I solve this problem, right? So they're all obviously interlinked. All these 3 forms of intelligence are interlinked. So we use these 3 as we go through our daily motions of life, right? In life, in any given day, you come across a situation that is novel. You have to use your creative intelligence. You come across a situation that requires you to reason. You use your analytical intelligence. And we live in Pakistan. So at least 50 times a day, you have to use what we call your street smarts, and you use your practical intelligence, right? Now we come to the best theory of intelligence, which is Howard Gardner's theory of intelligence. And Gardner, I know a lot about him. He was a cognitive developmentalist who never realized that his work would have so much application in education. And so starting out as a cognitive developmentalist, guess who Gardner was inspired by? He was inspired by Piaget. And he said that, well, yes, absolutely. Intelligence is something that we construct meaning. We make meaning of our environment, and that's where intelligence comes from. And then Howard Gardner talks about the need to unschool the mind, and he talks about how, where when we talk about he's written this book which is called Five Minds for the Future, and he presupposes the fact that everything, that the ways in which we're being educated, the skills you're learning, everything you're taught is very absolute, but the future requires very diverse and not subject specific learning, right? So basically in the future, if you are okay, not actually in the, we're already in the future now, because Five Minds for the Future was written like 10, 15 years ago. What he says is that the future requires human beings to possess diverse and complex abilities that work really well together. Okay, so Five Minds of the Future, he talks about how essentially what we need is, if you are studying artificial intelligence, you should also study at least literature or art or I don't know, psychology, definitely, right? So he says that the future is going to demand the exercise of multiple areas of knowledge and skills. And from there, his current theory, which is so important, so mind blowing, of multiple intelligence, where he says that all of us have these capacities, and we just, the difference is that we are all born with differing levels of each of them, right? So he says there's visual linguistic. There's actually, I don't remember all of them. So if you can give me a minute, I'll just open my reading up for it. Sorry. While I do that, something to think about. Well, I can tell you broadly what the different intelligences were, and then you can look them up. But he essentially presupposes that we have these 9 different types of intelligence. And amongst those, our visual linguistic intelligence, there's artistic intelligence, there's musical intelligence. And I think I should stop speaking in generalities. So give me 1 second. Yes, logical math. Oh, good. You are such good students. I can't find the reading and think I'm very sleepy. Logical, mathematical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, musical, intrapersonal, interpersonal, naturalist, linguistic. Yeah. So okay, since you know what these are, and since I love Howard Gardner, he also wrote this. His last, most recent book is called Truth, Beauty, and Goodness, where he is referring to this void in the world of these 3 things: truth, beauty, and goodness. And it relates to how we learn empathy and don't learn empathy. How do we know what's true in a world where there's so much fake news and so much hyperbole? And where is the good in people, essentially? And if you think about what's happening to your country right now as we try and learn this intro to psych course, this country is a mess. We're essentially being held hostage. Our government might collapse at any moment. We are totally negotiating with terrorists that we have created. So, just where is the goodness in people? And how does education help you bring that goodness to the fore? Right? So how does education, and this is Howard Gardner's essential question that he tried to answer his entire life. The question he's trying to answer is, how does education use what psychology teaches about the way people think, the way people learn, the way people reason, so that in this world we are able to value truth and beauty and goodness instead of, well, what we see around us, which is a complete and binary opposite of truth, beauty, and goodness. And I apologize if my political views are offensive to you. I realize now I shouldn't be talking about that. But the point is that understanding what comprises your intelligence also holds you accountable to using that intelligence, right? And coming back to the theoretical points of Howard Gardner, again, remember, he says that all of us have all of these intelligences, but we just have them in differing levels, right? So you might know someone who is a fantastic writer, but is not very good with Excel, right? Whereas you are someone to whom Excel feels like it's a Game Boy, you're so good at it, right? A Game Boy is a Nintendo game. I don't know if, I think it's called a Switch now. So when you open an Excel sheet, it's like you're playing a game. It comes so easily to you. But when the friend you have reads a book, they can read a book and understand the book in the space of like 4 hours. And for you, you can take a data set spanning 4 months, and in 4 hours, you can make sense of it on Excel. What's the difference here? It's not that there's something lacking in either of you. You're both equally intelligent, according to Gardner. It's just that how much logical mathematical intelligence you have is greater than that of your friend, whereas the linguistic intelligence your friend has is greater than the logical mathematics, than your linguistic intelligence, right? Or people who can literally, have you ever met anyone who can pick up any instrument and just start playing with it, and within an hour they know how to use it? It's musical intelligence, right? But all of us can listen to music, right? We can determine different pitch. We know what we like in music. We understand music. We know what music is sad music and what music is happy music. Is that not also indicative of some level of musical intelligence? Then, yes, Sadar, that's a really good point. The most obvious critique is how hard it is to test it, because it's so self-evident, right? And again, it's also very new. MI theory came about in, I think, the year 2000. And Gardner has been working towards it since the 80s. The 80s is where he started sort of realizing that everything he was doing, everything he was trying to understand about human intelligence and the way that humans think and learn and how cognition essentially works, that's his question, has really broad applications to education, right? And from there on, he became an educational cognitive developmental psychologist. But yes, MI theory needs a lot of testing. I mean, I don't know that there are any tests of MI theory or intelligence tests that account for MI theory. Does it mean that it is actually the differing levels of intelligence that are actually inherited? Some components we know of intelligence to be inherited, right? We know that 60% is inherited. So if what that intelligence is made up of, so if you have a child born into a family of musicians, the likelihood of that child inheriting musical talent is high, right? So musical intelligence is likely to be high. So think about it in that sense when we talk about heritability. Just remember, Gardner is saying you cannot reduce intelligence to one or two overarching things, because intelligence is a far more complex construct than that, right? In fact, think about this. Visual linguistic intelligence. So I don't know why it says linguistic. It should say visual linguistic, as I remember.
Spatial.
Hmm?
Linguistic verbal.
It's linguistic verbal. Thank you. Okay, so linguistic verbal intelligence. Everything I'm saying right now, you're understanding it. You're able to also answer questions that I'm asking you. But are you able to write a short story? All of you? Will it be a short story of exactly the same quality because you're all the same age, and let's assume that you all had the exact same education? No, the creativity of expression is going to vary from story to story to story, right? The narrative is going to vary, the ideas are going to vary. And so, again, it's not that you don't have that capacity, it's just that we all have it in different ways, right? Some people are more articulate than others. Some people are less. Some people are more artistic than others. Some people are less. But that does not mean that we as humans lack any of these capacities, which is why MI is such a great way. It's such a socially equitable way to look at intelligence, because you see, when you use MI theory, then you don't look at somebody who is living in a small tribe of the Amazon and say they're not intelligent. Instead, you say, well, perhaps the linguistic verbal level of intelligence is not as evolved as somebody who's traveled along the entire world and has learned 10 languages, but their bodily kinesthetic intelligence might be much higher. Their intrapersonal intelligence may be much higher because they're used to collective life, right? Very collectivist culture. So think about that. It's a great equalizer, MI theory. Because yes, intelligence has been a very racist construct, and it has been used to our great disadvantage, right? And continues to be in different ways. Even now, one of the most racial stereotypes of Asians is that all Asians are good at math. So even when taken positively, it's still a negative stereotype, right? In the sense that not all Asians are good at math, and why should they be expected to be, you know? So just sort of thinking through these things, and I'm only telling you about this because you have to understand there is a very definite impact in the world of these theories. Okay. And they really do affect the way that people are perceived, the way that people think they should behave, the way that people do behave, and so on and so forth. The way that what people feel they're entitled to and what they feel they're not entitled. All of this is coming from different sort of approaches within the sciences, hard sciences, as well as psychology, which is now more and more becoming a hard science because, you know, we do have new technology that enables us to look at things which we couldn't look at before. So phrenology is thankfully no longer an important way of determining intelligence. One important thing, one racist thing psychologists did was they said that if your skull is smaller, that means you're like less intelligent. And if your skull is bigger, so they went around and they exhumed bodies and they took dead bodies and they looked at skull size and they measured the actual size of the skull to support their racism. So, you know, what can one do? Anyway, thankfully, we don't do that anymore. And yes, the model minority myth, Nival, that's exactly the one that applies to Asians. You know, all brown people in the US are supposed to run gas stations and restaurants and convenience stores. So things like that, very important to think about. You know, it's the same thing when you go to a Western country and people say, your English is so good, and you want to correct them and say, well, what you're trying to say is I speak English really well. But they're the racists because do you see what the assumption is? right? And this is all, think about what we just learned about language, right? So you use this knowledge to contest and break down these theories, because over time, microaggressions, well, I'm going to give you a lecture on race and racism at the end of this class. It seems I can't help myself. But now I'll let you go. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I promise that I won't do it again. Now that I've made the promise, I can't. Okay. Can you tell us about the group projects, the group presentations we have next week? How do we need to go about it? Okay. I'll post a memo on this shortly, but essentially what you need to do is, whoever is in your group, first thing, get in touch with them. Second thing, if they don't respond to you within the next 2 days, please email me and let me know, because they will get a 0 and they will get removed from that group. ठीक है? तो पहली चीज ये logistics. दूसरी चीज, what is your presentation about? So, you know how in your reflection papers, I asked you to think about a theory and then tell me about what your thoughts are in a nutshell? In this, what you're going to do as a group is you're going to figure out a theory that you are all interested in or know a lot about. And then you're going to ask a question that you either use this theory to answer that question, right? So for example, you want to ask the question of, somebody asked this question. In fact, it was a really interesting question. I think, Sadaf, it was you who said, are people who are highly intelligent more prone to mental illness? That's a question, right? So to answer that question, you would draw on the theories of psychological disorders, or you draw on the theories of intelligence and the relationship between the two, and you would answer that question, right? So either you come up with a question and use theories to answer it, or you identify a theory and ask a larger question about that theory. So for example, with Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, maybe a group decides to ask the question, how accurate and how reliable is this way of looking at intelligence, right? So to put the presentation together, you have to be answering a question. And to answer that question, you will need to do research. And you will need to provide a list of the resources at the end of your presentation, a list of the resources or a bibliography कि आपने कहाँ कहाँ से अपना information ढूंढा था. Your presentation cannot just consist of what's in the textbook, ठीक? Which is why it is a group effort, because research is easier to do in such a short time when you're part of a group. So I strongly suggest कि बहुत दफ़ा students ये करते हैं कि they ask 2 people in the group to do the research, they assign 1 person to make the presentation, and they assign 1 person to talk. So just to clarify, each member of the group should have some contribution towards the research, and each member of the group should have some contribution towards the presenting part of it. Okay? If a member of your group is very uncomfortable with public speaking, just let me know so I can make a mental note, and that's okay. But I would really recommend for all of you to speak in this presentation. Okay? And your presentation should not be longer than 10 minutes. Okay? Did I tell you it's going to be next week? I don't think it's next week. 1 second. Oh yeah, it is next week. So, okay, some people, 26th or 28th go hogi aapki presentations. And if anybody is left over or there's not enough time, we'll figure out a different time for you. Then you can just present to me individually separate, but wo baad mein dekhenge. I think ho jayenge 2 din mein aapke. But just remember 10 minutes total, which includes your time for one question that I will ask you. Right? So just keep that in mind. All right, guys, I'll let you go. I'll see you on Wednesday, and I will post a memo with details on your presentation. Bye-bye.